Hi everyone, and welcome to the Atheist Pastor Show. I'm Chris, the Atheist Pastor. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button, share, like, hit the notifications so you never miss a thing. You always want to be in the loop. So on this channel, we're all about helping people get out of religion and walk away from religion. And something that's important is being able to share the journeys of people who have gone down that path. Now, a lot of us tend to talk with a lot of, the more evangelical, journeys. But today I'm pretty lucky to have a former Catholic priest with me. Now, we've got Matt Stephen here, and he reached out to me after seeing me on Truth Wanted, and he shared a bit of his story, and it's the kind of story that I think people need to hear, because I think committing to life as a Catholic priest is certainly something that it's not just not a small decision. It's a big decision, and to walk away from that is a big deal. So, Matt, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great to be here.
Yeah, and thanks for reaching out. Now, before we get into anything, look. A lot of you may or may not be aware that in Australia at the moment, we're going through a fairly bad drought, and we're having some fairly catastrophic fires that are ravaging the east coast at the moment. Look, I haven't put the link in yet, but I'm going to put the link in for the Rural Fire Service. Anyone who can donate, please do. There's a lot of religious charities out there that are fairly active at the moment, and while it's good that they do the work, I think it's better that it goes through to, where we know that the money's going to go directly to the fire service. So if I can encourage everyone, please do donate to the Rural Fire Service. So it's a big deal walking away from the priesthood, I'd imagine, Matt.
It is. It's takes a lot of thought and a lot of working through. In my case, it was simultaneously the hardest and easiest decision that I'd ever made. And I'm glad that I made the decision that I did a little over 11 years ago, and I'm very happy where I am now.
Excellent. So I guess to give us a little bit of background, were you raised Catholic?
In a roundabout sort of a way. Jewish mother, Catholic father. Okay. My parents' marriage split up when I was pretty young. Moved back to, I grew up in Melbourne, moved back from where I was born over in the West, moved back to Melbourne, lived with my grandparents for a while, and Dad remarried. So we there was the sort of cultural Irish Catholic kind of, let's go to church at Christmas and maybe at Easter and for the occasional wedding or whatever, but that was about it. It was probably more of a cultural thing, we're Irish, we're Catholic, this is what we do. And so, yeah, really growing up, not a great deal other than that. It was probably more the stories of the Irish side of things, which just happened to be Catholic rather than, the other way around. Mm-hmm. And when I was about 12, I moved in with my grandmother. I had a few challenges at home, so moved out of home and moved in with my grandmother. And she was the one who had the fairly strong Catholic faith, which was terrific. It was one of those types of faith that it certainly wasn't an intellectual faith, but it was a faith that said, let's try and help people. And I was pretty impressed with that as I went through my secondary school years. Mm-hmm. In my early 20s, I got right into it, got involved with some Catholic youth groups down in Melbourne that were very much focused on an intellectual side of, upholding and defending the faith as they sort of spoke about, and studying the history and studying why the Catholic Church teaches the things that it does, and seeing that, you can back this up with scripture and you can back this up with history and all of that sort of thing, which led me to the point, I kind of got the idea, of course, it's like anyone who's considering ministry, there's always a lot of people around who are going to support you and encourage you and pat you on the back and say, yeah, great idea. So I certainly had a fair bit of that. Yes. Went and stayed at the seminary where you study for the Catholic priesthood for a few days and enjoyed it, and then made the plunge. So packed up my boxes of things and moved off to the seminary, and in 1996 spent the 7 odd years, was ordained in 2002, And and that was it. So there I was.
So how old were you when you had made, so obviously going back to 96 is when I guess you started the journey. At what point did you decide that was the life that you wanted to lead?
Well, I pretty much worked with the idea that I'll give it a go. If it's not meant to be, I will just pull the pin. I'll go back home and I'll return to what I was doing. But that didn't happen. So I just kept going, and so I was 24 when I started. I was a little over 30 when I was ordained to, they talk about being ordained to the diaconate as a deacon within the Catholic Church. So as a transitional deacon, which means you're a deacon for a while before you're ordained a priest, you're a deacon for about a year. And I was 30 when I was ordained a deacon and 31 when I was ordained a priest.
Okay. So as far as, so prior to, I guess, just making that decision, the few years, I guess, between secondary school and going there, had you studied further, or you mentioned that you had an interest in the history of the church and the was that something that had interested you?
It had. I grew up in a family where history was valued. So social history, Australian history, world history, military history. I'm a bit of a military tragic even today. Study the wars and our own military history. I went through a phase, history of railways and tramways and that sort of thing. Also aviation, and I'm still involved in historic aviation to this day. I sort of tinker with old aeroplanes. I live in the country now, so it's a bit of travelling to get to where I work on or play with old aircraft, but I still have a bit of an involvement there. So Dad was a psychologist, and so I was always in that milieu of tertiary studies, although at that stage I hadn't gone on it, hadn't undertaken any myself. But there was always that idea that you're always studying, you're always learning something. So as part of an extension, I suppose, of my general interest in history, there was an interest in peoples and over the years, and that sort of translated into a bit of a church history interest. So how did things happen, not so much biblical times, but definitely after that, how did, the cultures that fostered the church grow? And what happened in the Middle Ages and what happened in more recent years and all of that. So when you're looking at it from that perspective, almost as an intellectual exercise with a lot of human stories involved, it's possible to, I suppose, you presuppose a lot of things, and I'll get to that a bit later because that was a big part of my journey later, the realisation of a lot of presuppositions that I'd just always held to be the case, which didn't really stand up to examination. But I suppose I didn't really get interested and active probably till after I left school. So that 18 through to 24, that was really my growing study years before I went off to the seminary.
Okay. And when you were, I guess, being someone who was looking into and delving into the history and the intellectual side, was it only the Catholic side that you looked into, or did you look into the Protestant or Orthodox denominations, or I guess have it coming from a Jewish family as well? Was that ever a consideration?
Interestingly enough, not really. I suppose because I had spent those years with my grandmother, and I was pretty impressed with the way that she lived her life. And she was a beautiful person. She was genuinely a good person. And she taught me actually that it's possible to have a belief in a God and also have a sense of humour. And I think that's important. I mean, whether you're a believer or not, I think a sense of humour, especially the way the world is at the moment, you've got to be able to laugh, otherwise you'll cry. And
you need it, don't you?
So exactly right. So I suppose my study of other religions was sort of through the eyes of Rome, I suppose you could say. How did they interact? How did they come about? Or there's the classic Catholic position that how did people drift away or rebel or walk away or whatever from Holy Mother Church into the, and take up silly ideas. Probably that's a bit of a slight simplification. But so it was fundamentally the Catholic perspective, because my understanding, I think, was a bit, you could possibly say a bit curated, a bit sort of guided in that direction, because I was studying with people who, knew a lot more and came from that Catholic perspective. So when you're learning about things, if you're taught that this is how it is and this is the right way to look at things, then yeah, that's really how it goes.
And I guess that's something that is fairly big in the Catholic movement. It is very hierarchical. And
oh, definitely.
I guess, so with that not questioning, does that only extend to the Pope, or how far up the tree, I guess, is it your direct superior, for lack of a better term, or the...
Yeah, there's a lot of authority, I suppose you'd say, and there are, sadly enough, there are a lot of, and I mean, the sexual abuse, horrors of sexual abuse, that's a whole topic all of itself, and I could easily talk for 3 hours about that. But I mean, that aside, that was nurtured in a culture that says you give obedience without questioning. You respect, it comes from your position, it's not earned. So I suppose a lot of people have authority. So as a young priest, you're usually an assistant priest in the parish. You don't start off in the parish by yourself, so you start off with an older priest. I was very fortunate to have a really decent fellow as my parish priest. He, interestingly enough, he was very good and very understanding when I left. Great fella. But there were a lot of other parish priests. A few of my colleagues had parish priests who were very, this is what you'll do and this is when you'll go out and this is what you'll talk about. So, I mean, that's probably what they got. Doesn't excuse it. But, I mean, if you want to be a petty careerist, the Catholic Church is the way to go.
Yep.
Probably not now as much as it was 20 years ago, purely because, the windows have been opened and the lights shone in on, and the cockroaches have all had to scurry away. But there's very much that.
I guess having, and I don't want to touch too much on this in this conversation, but I guess there's obviously a lot of things in the media, and there's a lot of reports, and I think that it's a bit of the running joke about the Catholic priest. From your experience in the church, I guess, how do you react to that, or what are your thoughts on a lot of, I guess, what's reported?
Well, I think a lot of it happened because there were people who never should have been allowed to study and to take that path in the first place. I think a lot of it happened because it was seen as a spiritual problem rather than a psychological problem. An attraction towards children, which I think sometimes was, I suppose, being a priest doesn't necessarily make you like that. But if you have those tendencies, especially years ago, it was a great place to be because especially, there might be a level of, the running joke that I used to have with people was that the whole Asperger's syndrome, which is, I grew up in a situation of my brother was diagnosed very early on with Asperger's before it was really known. And so for, that kind of, for people in that sort of a situation who may not have great non-verbal awareness, social awareness, that sort of thing, the church provided a fabulous environment because it had structure, it had rules, it didn't change. You could be a part of things, and if you weren't really good at reacting with other people, then that didn't really matter because you're there and you're doing what you're doing and you're saying your masses and you're going out and you're visiting the sick and you're doing all of that sort of thing. And I think the problem there was it was a bit of a hothouse in that it nurtured people who might have had psychological issues who should never have been allowed to be part of it. But also when it came from the perspective of, okay, this is a spiritual problem and I have a problem, I've done this, I'll pray harder, I'll ask God to help me, and I'll just keep trying. And of course, it's not a spiritual problem at all. It goes so far deeper than that. And I think that the Catholic structures were in a lot of senses, they gave you authority. No one questions father, especially in the 50s and 60s and right through to the 80s. Probably less so from the 90s onwards because it was becoming pretty known. My first awareness of the fact that there were real problems were probably the early 90s, which interestingly enough was before I went in, but it only really became widespread known sort of then on. And it was, okay, these are the exceptions rather than the rule. But I mean, the whole structure and the whole layout of the organisation was such that people like that were nurtured.
And when, I guess, someone is looking to or has made the decision to become a priest or decided, what is the process? I mean, is there a vetting process? Is it just a case of you say, I want to be a priest, and they say, great, sign here, and in you come?
Well, there's a vetting process now because one has had to be put in place, and from the late 90s onwards, that was pretty much compulsory. From the 70s onwards, the more progressive seminaries, the dioceses, whatever you want to say, started having psych assessments. But there were places that didn't, and the place that I went to, a little place in the country, didn't have that psych assessment. You went and you spoke with the bishop, and if the bishop liked you, and you had a few chats, and you stayed at the seminary for a week, and you sort of got the once over, and I think they sort of tested out how you interacted with other people. You were there, you met a few locals who'd come and say hello and all. If you didn't look too scary, then give you a go, because I think their idea was, well, if you're not suitable, that'll become apparent pretty quickly. But since then, thankfully, they have incorporated full psych assessment beforehand. So I mean, these days you couldn't join without getting a full psych assessment.
So once you're in, so it's the seminary that you go into to essentially study. And
that's right.
I'm guessing that's live in and full time. And
that's right.
What's life there like? I guess as far as is it all study, or is there? I'd imagine you get up and have breakfast and make your bed. Is it overly militarized, or?
Well, there certainly is an element of some fairly it's quite structured. And the seminary that I went to was based on how things were done for hundreds of years, really. So there was very much a strict timetable. Throughout the week, the bell would go to wake you up and go about 6 a.m. You'd have to be in the chapel at 6:30. They had what they called meditation, which was just private prayer, reflecting on the Bible or whatever, reflecting on spiritual readings of Catholic authors. Then you'd have Mass, so the service at 7. 7:30 you'd go and have brekkie. 8:45 you'd start classes. There'd be 4 classes in different subjects that took you through to lunchtime. After lunch, from sort of about 1:30 to 3:30, was pretty much free time. After that, there might be sport or outdoor working out in the gardens or cleaning or whatever. Then there would be evening prayer. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that they have what they call the Liturgy of the Hours, which is it is quite scriptural. So what they did, the 150 Psalms were arranged in a 3-year cycle. So you'd read a group of Psalms in the morning, and then there would be a scriptural reading and a few other prayers. And that was said in community. So you'd have that as the morning prayer, then you'd have one at midday before lunch, then you'd have one in the evening, and you'd have one at night before you went to bed. So we worked our way through to evening prayer, then you'd have something to eat about 6. Then some nights there were classes for a couple of hours after that. There was choir practice once a week. There was pastoral work where you'd go out and work at the local men's shelter or various other places, come back for night prayer at about, I think it was a bit after 9, and then you'd go back into your room. So that was pretty much...
Sorry, I was going to say one thing that Catholic priests, especially those with Irish heritage, are notorious for is maybe liking a sneaky whiskey or two after.
Yep.
What was the party life like? I guess how did the wannabe Catholic priests in seminary? What was the nightlife like?
The nightlife, well, after your first 6 months, which was, they called it your spiritual semester, Saturdays were a big spiritual day. But after your first 6 months, Saturday was your day off. So you'd have morning prayers in the morning, and then you were free from morning prayer until night prayer at 9:30. So you'd do what you wanted on most Saturdays. You might go out to lunch, you might go out to tea, you might go down to the pub, you might go out with friends, whatever, so long as you all came stumbling back or tearing, the cars had become screeching into the car park at, just in time for night prayer, and the car doors would be thrown open and you'd bolt across the car park into the chapel. So there wasn't a lot of opportunities during the week you generally couldn't really go out, but you could have a quiet drink and a bit of a chat with a few of your friends during the week. But Saturdays, that was when you had the opportunity to go out and have a few laughs or whatever if you were that way inclined. If you were more of the serious spiritual type, then you were working for the salvation of souls, so you didn't really have time for that nonsense.
So I'll ask the most important question: which one were you?
Yep.
Were you the serious type, or was it an enjoyable?
I actually, in my third year at the seminary, there were questions. I was dragged before the bishop one day because questions had been raised by some of the more serious students and some of the faculty members, because I was a bit loud and liked to joke and was possibly a little less disciplined than I could have been. So they sent me off at that stage. I hadn't had a psych assessment when I started, but this was around the time that psych assessments were starting. So they thought I was a little bit not fitting in as well as I could have done. So they sent me down to Melbourne, and I had a fairly complicated week of very in-depth psych assessments. Okay. And I came back with a clean bill of health to say that I was fine. I just didn't take things as seriously as I could have and just relax and don't worry about it. So I enjoyed life. Still do.
Well, that's a very Australian thing, though, isn't it? It's
absolutely. Absolutely.
So as far as how many people were, or how many other students were at the seminary at any given time?
So there were 6. Started off with 6 in my year, and that was the last big year. There was sort of 1s and 2s and 3s in subsequent years. So there were probably about 25 students, and there were 3 or 4 resident priests. So you had the rector of the college, the vice rector. They both were teachers as well. So had a spiritual director and another one living in. So they gave classes. Other priests came in to give classes. We had other people who weren't priests came in and gave classes in various areas. So the study program was such that there were a lot of people coming and going. We also had external students, people who, like if you wanted to be a Catholic teacher, for example, you had to do at least one subject at the seminary about church history and all of that sort of thing, or introduction to Catholic doctrine, I think it was, just so to make sure that the good teachers were obedient and towed the party line. So they used to come in at night, and that was pretty funny actually, because you had all of these young 20-something teaching students coming along, and you'd be like, oh, okay, of course, and for those of you who are only human, you'd be like, hello, but we weren't encouraged to be too friendly or whatever, but you'd chat and you'd have a coffee and all of that sort of thing, but it is very Aussie to enjoy being real, and some of us had that opportunity to do so.
So out of the, so there were 6 that went through in your year. Out of those, for instance, how many then did go on to the priesthood?
I'm just trying to think now. I think 2 left in the first year. I think 4 got through. Well, no, 4 got almost through, and 1 left just before he was ordained. So there were 3 of us ordained.
Okay. And do you know,
which is pretty average.
Of those, are you the only one that's left, or you're not too sure?
I am, well, I'm actually from that particular college, which was the most conservative Catholic seminary in Australia. There's only 2 of us. I'm the only one who's gone the entire way through that college who's left.
Wow.
So probably...
So do you think they'll have a plaque up or anything? Is that an achievement?
Well, it was interesting actually, because what they used to do was they used to take a big photo, and they hung a photo in one of the corridors, an ordination photo. In fact, what I might do is I'll just go for a quick walk. I've got a copy of mine.
Fantastic.
I might just take you around. And they hung these photos in, sorry about the darkness. I'll just pull the light on. They hung these photos in the hallway, and the big running joke was, okay, when I left, my photo was going to be removed or turned around or whatever. But apparently it's still there. So they acknowledged
Fantastic.
the fact that I was there, and I was there for a priest for 5 odd years. But that was so yeah. So apparently my picture's still there, and I've got a copy of it hanging on the. I'm not sure if you can see really well. Probably, yeah. The light from the phone's reflecting. So I might see if I can do a side sort of a. So yeah.
Now just be careful to cover your plaque so you don't completely dox yourself as well.
Exactly right. So there we go. So there, I'll send you a photo actually if you like.
Absolutely.
So and I've also got a copy of my ordination card, which as ordained a priest of our Lord Jesus Christ, the most reverend blah 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 on this date, and I've got 1 Corinthians 4:1. Hang on. Thus one should regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God, which was pretty much the motto that I had. Your work to help people. So I'm not sure if that picture came through very well, but it was a very serious picture of myself in all of my robes, standing in front of a marble altar in a little old church somewhere.
I was going to say your choice in clothes has definitely changed over the last few years.
It has, yeah. Despite the t-shirt, I'm not wearing as much black as I used to. Exactly right. Not wearing as much black as I used to do. So yeah.
No collar. That's
no collar.
So
only for parties.
Well, now do you still have your priest outfit? There's a question. Do you still have it?
I do.
They didn't make you give it back?
No, because that was one of the things that you had to buy yourself out of the small allowance that you got. So some of the vestments, some of the robes were communally owned, so they went back. But I've still got a bit of a range of them. I'm not sure why I kept them, but some of them are still in suitcases around. Just every now and then, I have a bit of a look and a little chuckle to myself, and I think, oh well, that's
handy for Halloween.
Handy for Halloween, exactly right.
Absolutely. So you've gone through seminary, you've graduated, and you're ordained as a priest. So
that's right.
At that point, do you have a choice in where you go, or do they say, well, Matt, you're going here?
Yeah, you don't have a complete choice. What happened with me was the bishop said, okay, we've got these particular places that are going to need an assistant priest. Do you have any preferences? And I said yes. And the interesting thing was my great uncle. This is quite a coincidental fact, given the fact that I didn't really grow up as a believer or active or anything like that. My great uncle, so the grandmother who brought me up, her brother had been a priest, and despite the fact that we grew up, in another state, her brother was a priest in the small town where I live now. And that town, that was going to need an assistant priest. So I went through the college knowing that he had been in the area. He died in the early 70s, but there were still a few people who knew him. And that this parish came up, and I just said, oh, yeah, I'd love to go there if I could. And the bishop said, yeah, rightio. The old priest in the parish was retiring. So there was another priest who was going to move out here, and he needed an assistant. So the bishop said, yeah, okay, you can go there, but you'll probably be there for a year or two just to help the older priest, just to, build the place up a bit, settle, take a bit of the load off his shoulders. And a year and a half went by, and I was having a great time and really enjoying it, and things were going pretty well. So I said, oh, can I stay a bit longer? So I got another year, and then a couple more years after that. Then he finally just said, I'm going to have to move you because we need, numbers are such that we need you somewhere else. So I got moved somewhere else. But things happened then, and I left, and I'll get to that. It's probably better to tell that a little bit later in the story. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess you've gone to the town. You've gone as an assistant priest. Yep. Now, is that the usual step? I'm assuming you don't just go straight out of seminary into here's your own church. Obviously, being a smaller town, and I guess a new priest and a new assistant priest. Yeah. How was the local Catholic community with that change? I guess especially taking over from an older. Did the older priest stay in the community, or did he retire?
He was there. He was there for a little while, retired, living next door. And there was a bit of friction there because he was quite conservative. And even though I studied at a conservative seminary, I was quite progressive in a lot of my ways, so I still wore the collar and all, but, I had the new Commodore, and I used to listen to a bit of doof music and all of that sort of thing. And that worked really well with younger people, gave a bit of humanity to it all. But he quickly decided that I was, really not very good. So he got cranky and snappy and talked behind my back and all of that. But he moved away fairly quickly. But the actual parish priest that I started with, he was just terrific. He understood that I had a fair bit of enthusiasm and was going to do things my own way, and he gave me a very free rein. Generally, as in answer to your question, yes, generally what would happen, you'd work with an experienced priest for a couple of years, several years, then you might get an opportunity to take over a small, really small country parish in a small country town and work there for a while, and then, move to bigger places, or you might look after a couple of towns or whatever. So yeah, they don't let you in your own place straight up, and that's a handy thing, I think, because you learn about the administrative realities and the social realities of it all and what it's like to work, because it's all fairly theoretical when you're learning about it, even though there were opportunities at the seminary to do pastoral work, and so we worked with Vinnies, and we worked with homeless situations, and we worked learning about economical things, and worked at the hospital, worked at the schools. So you got a bit of an idea, but working with someone who knows the ropes really is a good way to do it. So it's almost like you do a couple of years apprenticeship with someone who's been around for a while. Okay. And
so at what point would it normally be expected that, I guess, you would get your own church?
Probably after about four or 5 years, generally that would be considered. These days it's possibly a bit less, just based on numbers. And I mean the diocese, so the diocese is the geographical area, bishop, there's a bishop or an archbishop in a diocese, and there might be, in our one there were about 30 parishes centred around a large rural city. And so now where was I just completely lost my train of thought, which is what I do. Just ask my wife; she loves it.
I've got the same problem. Don't worry.
That's it. So you probably about 4 or 5 years, and I had actually been offered a couple of parishes at the time that I left. So I was due to get my own parish or look after a parish by myself.
So as far as the senior Catholics go, was there much interaction with the senior Catholics? I guess either the cardinals, the popes, or the
not really. Not really. So you'd see the bishop fairly regularly, and the bishop was one of 50, 60 bishops in Australia. Occasionally the cardinal would come around. The cardinal who's in the news at the moment, of course, whose appeal in the High Court's been granted today, apparently. He visited several times when he was just a bishop before he became the Archbishop of Melbourne and then the Archbishop and the Cardinal of Sydney. I knew him. I met him a number of times. He knew me. He was actually, when not long before I was due to become a deacon, our bishop became really sick, the bishop who started the seminary. And so they appointed a new bishop. And in that meantime, what happens when they make a bishop? That bishop has to be, they call it, consecrated by 3 bishops. So Pell was one of the 3 who came down, and they had a big celebration and big consecration and all that. And by this stage, I was a deacon, so I was actually standing next to him, all robed up at the altar. Of course, that was 17 odd years ago now, so that was well before things got out. But so you'd see them from time to time. I did meet Pope John Paul, but that was because I had travelled over to Rome under my own steam before I went to the seminary, and it was just a meet and greet handshake sort of a thing. So I went to Rome a couple of times, but generally, especially in a country place, there wouldn't really be much reason why you might meet the movers and shakers.
So just like anything, they like to stay in the city and keep away from the regional areas, which are the best
flies,
areas.
pies and bindi eyes, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's people don't realise how good it is.
Oh, that's exactly right.
So one thing you did mention was, I guess, then you were talking about the ceremony. ordain or to make a new bishop, and there is a lot of ceremony that is in, I guess, the Catholic faith.
Absolutely, yeah.
As far as I guess there's a lot of pagan origin to that. How is that generally explained in the church setting? Like, as far as the reasons for doing what they do?
Kind of like Christmas. They say, okay, this was a pagan ceremony, this was a pagan festival occasion that was Christianized, taken. So the structure of it, the outline of it was taken, and it was, they called sanctified by use or Christianized or whatever you want to say. So done for the glory of God rather than for any other reason. Acknowledging one thing that Catholics do well is it was a very sensory way of celebrating. So it was the music, it was the incense, it was the bells, it was the sights, the almost dramatic structure of the ceremonies, especially back in the days when it was all done in Latin, facing a big marble altar away from the people. So that was all quite dramatic and ceremonial. But that was seen as, okay, that's focusing on the whole transcendent idea of God, and God is way up there and we have to give him glory through clouds of incense. And also there was a link made with the whole Jewish Old Testament offering sacrifice kind of
He loves his burnt meat, God, doesn't he?
Oh, exactly right. I don't mind a barbecue myself, but, you know... Exactly right. So, I mean... You should
have encouraged more burnt offerings than while you were a priest. You could have had all the barbecue you wanted.
Exactly right.
So how would you, as a priest, have dealt with a lot of, I guess, the contradictions in the Bible? So, for example, if one of your parishioners had have come up to you and asked questions, say, about the difference in genealogy between Matthew and Luke, what would the Catholic response to that be?
The one that I remember was, well, imagine there are 4 people who see a car crash. I'm not sure why car crash was the chosen thing, but they're all going to report it slightly differently. One person saw the car had an indicator, and another one thought the car didn't have an indicator on. Someone was looking at this. So they're all going to look at things slightly differently, and they're going to report it slightly differently. And I mean, the whole point about the genealogies and all of that is, well, there might be a few odd different names here and there, but the whole fundamental thing is it's about... I don't actually hold this myself. I'm just sort of as it was explained to me. It's about giving an understanding of the fact that God is faithful to his people, and there's a whole lineage of people, and some of them might be missed along the way in this version, but you put them all together and it tells the whole story. So that was quite clever, really, because okay, Father.
Aren't literalists at all. So they're not believers that the Bible is literally word for word true, or just when it's convenient? When
it's convenient, pretty much. And that's why there's the Catholic, it is possible as a Catholic not to. And funny enough, that didn't happen all that often, because there was what they call the lectionary, which was the scriptures that were read at different throughout the year, and that was a 3-year cycle. So you'd have Gospels and you'd have Old Testament readings and New Testament epistles readings, but none of the difficult ones were ever touched on. So, I mean, there was no Exodus 21. There was, you can beat your slave, and if they don't die in a day or two, you won't be punished. That was, funny enough, that never really made it into the, the weekday mass on the Wednesday of...
That's surprising, because, I mean, what is more loving than not beating your slave to death?
I know, right? It's just a beautiful thing,
What about Ezekiel 23:20? Did that ever come up? That's my favourite verse by a long shot.
I don't. I am. I don't. I do love a good, story of sisters and story of, faithfulness and Jerusalem and all of that sort of thing. A couple of those Ezekiel ones are fairly racy. I actually remember...
Ancient Israel might have been the place to be sometimes when they were being invaded and killing and murdering.
Exactly right. There was a fair bit of Balchika wow going on. So
might have been more progressive than the conservative Christian right would let us think.
Exactly right. But we won't talk about that, because that's or the Catholics never talked about that, and I suppose a lot of Christians these days, that's the Old Testament. We won't worry about that. So, I mean,
I love
selfish. It's sort of selfish. I was having that discussion with someone the other day about, homosexuality and all that. And I said, well, do you like prawns? Yeah. Well, yeah,
I'd be more concerned with that mixed fabric. You've got to watch that mixed fabric.
Right. Exactly right. I can't be wearing my...
Fabric's good, but mixed fabric.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. So there goes that 70s polyester shirt of mine. I'm in trouble.
Oh, see, well, there you go. It was that mixed fabric that probably led you away from the faith. That's no doubt about that.
I see it all now.
So let's get into, I guess, why you did walk away, because obviously committing to be a Catholic priest and I guess making the decision, I guess especially as a young man, that you're prepared to enter a life of celibacy and I guess service to the church where you're living it and breathing it. Actually, sorry, before we get to that, let's talk about your life, your day-to-day life as a priest. I know we touched on the seminary a little bit. What was a typical week like for a Catholic or an assistant Catholic priest in a small town?
Well, I was very fortunate, as I said. I had a very understanding parish priest who gave me a free rein. And it was a great way really to learn about life. You could learn about as much about life or as little about life. You could stay in, so the priest's house is called the presbytery. You could stay in the presbytery as much as you wanted. You could spend a lot of time in the church if you wanted, or you could get out there. So I spent a lot of time at the parish school, and that was terrific. My whole attitude was, a lot of these people are never going to have a decent experience of faith, of religion, so give them a good one. So when it came to the parish school, I'd go in, crack jokes, really, really bad jokes, as corny. I always went for quantity of jokes rather than quality. I'm still a believer in the dad joke as the greatest form.
It's the best joke, the absolute best joke you can have.
Exactly right.
No doubt.
I'd tell the jokes, get the kids just howling with laughter, and then might just say a little, okay, folks, this is an encouragement to be good to one another, and then off I'd go, to the disgust of the teachers who had to pick up the pieces. But they, funny enough, exactly right. But the funny thing was, because I had the fairly conservative priest before me, if you come in and you're good with people and you listen and you go out of your way to be encouraging and supporting of people, after there's been a priest who's been telling them all that they've got to do this and they've got to do that and they're probably going to burn anyway, you can almost do no wrong, because it's like, okay, and my approach was always just to be interested in people and to listen to people and to try and give them a good experience. And that was further encouraged when the bishop, he offered me the chaplaincy role at one of the Catholic secondary schools in the city, in the centre of the area. So I became the chaplain to the secondary school, and that was really good, because same thing, I'd visit the classes and all, and the kids came to see me as someone that they could talk to, who wouldn't take it back to the teachers, who wouldn't, and so I think there was a lot of teenage angst that I was able to listen to and just give encouragement about, and remind people that, they were people, you're trying your best and you're a good person, so don't be discouraged or whatever. And then, so there were 2 Catholic secondary schools in the area, and then the chaplaincy of the second one came up. So I ended up being the chaplain to both of the schools. But so I was the chaplain at one of the schools for pretty much my whole time, and the chaplain of the second one for about a year before I left. So when I left, they haven't actually replaced me, because they haven't been able to get someone who could go in regularly. So priests from time to time go in there. And I think that's a shame, because if you're a school chaplain, you make a connection with people. You're there at the important events and occasions and ceremonies of the school. You're there at the good times. You're also there at the tough times. Like, there was one kid who was killed in a car crash. So spent a lot of time talking with people about that. And also I spent a lot of time at the local. So we got the little hospital in the town, and the big hospital in the main centre, which is half an hour away. And so for me, it was about getting out and speaking with people and spending time with people. In tough times, like during funerals, so you'd be spending time with grieving families, spending time with people who might have lost babies. If so there are things you remember. You remember the first time you're with someone who when they pass away. You remember the first time, someone who's lost a baby. You remember seeing your first deceased baby. You remember your first car crash. You remember, and for me, it was a real privilege, as it still is, to spend time with people in grief. And for me, it wasn't about saying God has a plan or anything like that. It was just saying, okay, I'm here. I don't have the answers, but I'm here. And I could be a punching bag sometimes, and that's fine. I was quite happy with that, because I realised myself the ridiculousness of trying to say, oh, well, it's all part of God's plan, because
and I think that's the worst thing you can say. It's right. It still baffles me why. I guess I know within the the more charismatic circles, that's how we were trained. It was in those moments of grief that, it's part of God's plan, and we can't understand God's mysteries, and His ways are greater than ours. And I never bought that, and I know, I suffered loss myself. I know people who have suffered loss, and I can't think of anything worse. It's you'd really think that, especially with modern psychology and techniques to help people grieve through processes, that the church would adapt. But it sounds like at least you were on the right track. So with I guess being in a town, there probably wouldn't be a huge social life out there. But how did you find you generally got on with, I guess, the other guys your age? Were you able to make friends, or did you have mates?
Well, I put on a heap of weight, because you're often going out to dinner at people's places, and there wasn't a whole lot, we couldn't have relationships, so ate or drank. That was a way of getting a bit of, physical enjoyment. And so I'd been there about 2 or 3 years when my weight was, I was nearly 150 kilos. And the funeral director who I had been working with, she just said, I like working with you. I don't want to work on you. So you are coming to the gym with me. So she started dragging me kicking and screaming down to the local gym. And one of the fellows there, one of the gym instructors, he sort of decided to give me a fair bit of time, and he became my personal trainer. So through him, I started going out to the local pubs. And so here he came, Father Matt, he'd come down to the pub, and that was a great way of just working with, seeing people who you otherwise wouldn't see. And they came to realise that, here's the priest, and he's an all right bloke, and he'll come and have a drink with us and laugh with us. And from that, I started going to the footy. They actually got me to do a blessing one year when they were in the grand final, and they won the grand final. But I'm not going to claim anything there. They won the grand final because they were better than the other team, not because of any magical sky stuff. But so
God loves your sport.
Oh, sorry, exactly. True that. Yeah, true. So got pretty involved in the social life in town, and we actually at one point probably, and so as I was losing weight, I was getting a fair bit of confidence back, and I was going out a fair bit. That was fine. There might be some times after a big Saturday night when Sunday morning it'd be okay. We're just going to have a short sermon today, I think. Well, because I don't want to keep you too long or anything.
Contemplation.
Exactly right. Exactly right. These ones.
So when you go to the pub, were you frocked up, or did you have the collar, or it was just?
No, I often, after I was probably only about 18 months, I stopped regularly wearing the collar. I'd wear it for when I was working or big occasions or whatever, but I'd often get around town and especially once I started losing weight, I'd get around town in sort of jeans and a t-shirt or whatever, and they all knew me. But yeah, so for me, and that was just another thing that my conservative confreres looked with horror at. And so I suppose I wasn't the typical conservative priest. And, there were some who said when I left, there were some who said, oh, yeah, well, we knew that was going to happen because you weren't faithful to your training, and you weren't faithful to the way that priests should be, and a priest should be an example to the people, not a dirtbag or anything like that. And I wasn't a dirtbag. I was just enjoying myself and showing people that you can enjoy life as well, because especially in a rural setting where farmers work their guts out. We went through a long period of drought around that time, so there was a lot of depression, and there was a lot of mental health issues going on. And so spending time, if you're having a drink with people, that's why the men's shed set up is such a good thing for men's mental health, because you're sitting there, you're having a chat, you're having a drink, you're having a coffee or whatever, but you're really able to, in a non-directive kind of a way, listen to people and encourage people. And so really, as time went on, I saw myself more as someone who was working for the good of people who just happened to be in the God context. I could have easily done the same thing if I was you know, a paid social worker or something like that. So the faith side of it, I was still within that framework, but a lot of what I did, you know, I certainly wasn't going into the pub and I would say to you, my brothers and sisters, you know, put your beers down, we're going to have Bible study or anything like that.
No turning water into wine, or?
I tell you what, I would have been popular if I could have done that. I probably turn it into pear cider myself, or, you know, a nice, you know, 8-year-old Scotch or something like that. But
you are talking my language.
Excellent. But yeah.
So I guess all of that, and obviously it was something that was an important part of your life, and you had made a decision to walk away from it, which would be a big deal.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into that, I'm just going to very quickly say, anyone who is watching, if you do have any questions, throw them in the chat and we will definitely get to them later. Or if you want to send me a tweet, if you don't want it out there publicly, I can always ask I will ask the questions after. So walking away, talk us through what happened.
A couple of big things happened. So 2005, I've really started getting into getting my health back. So I'm working with people, a lot of people outside. And I mean, in the town, there was probably 25% Catholic. But everyone knew everyone. And the funny thing was, it was one of those very rare situations in the early 2000s where they had a very good ministers fraternal, they called it. So all the ministers of the different churches would get together once a month. And we had the Anglican minister who was, let's say, so I was probably at this time, I was 34, 35. The young Anglican minister was about the same age as was the Baptist minister. And there was a Presbyterian uniting minister who used to come in from not far away, she was in her 60s. And then, of course, there was my parish priest who was in his early 70s. So there were three of us in our mid-30s, which was quite unusual for a mainline, I suppose, mainline non-evangelical group of church ministers.
And so in the Catholic Church, and it sounds more like a Hillsong sort of age.
Yeah, exactly right.
The Anglican, obviously
exactly right. And I mean,
yeah.
Well, that's it. The average age these days of your mainline ministers or priests is a lot older than that. So that's right. We're talking walking away. So a couple of things happened. We had a bushfire that ripped through the town one day. After that, there's one young fellow, parishioner actually, who was very badly burnt, and he spent 9 months recuperating in hospital before he was able to come home. Wow. And the interesting thing was that it happened on a Sunday. So we had the services in the morning, and it was a stinking hot day. And at the end of Mass, I just said, well, this is horrible bushfire weather, so I hope we're all right and everyone stays safe. And I was fairly tired, so I went in home and had a sleep. And then the phone rang and I got woken up and someone said, look out your back window, and there was a wall of smoke. So this bushfire went around town, and actually the young fellow who was badly burned had been at Mass that morning. And I was talking with him on the steps out the front of the church afterwards. So that was horrific. The fire didn't go through town itself. It went just around the outskirts. I was evacuated down to the hospital. So I was working there with people who were being brought in with burns and being brought in with, heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation and all that sort of thing. So it was a frantic day. And when you're looking at a wall of smoke, as a lot of people in New South Wales are at the moment, if you're looking at a wall of smoke, it's like, oh dear, it's like, anything could happen. And back in the days of the indestructible Nokia 3310, I think I still had the old Nokia then. I sent a message to pretty much to everyone to say, there's a fire coming our way. I don't know what's going to happen. It's been fun. And so nothing happened to me particularly that day. But a big thing that happened after it was I'd had ups and downs with my own mental health, a bit of depression, anxiety over the years. But seeing and dealing with people who'd been burnt out, and that really, I really sank. And I didn't quite shake my fist at heaven and say why, but I thought to myself, there were a lot of people who were, and I can completely understand that. And I thought to myself, I'm going to try and put something together. People were questioning whether there was a God. And it was kind of around about this stage that I tried to put something together, and I realized, well, I kind of can't. I can't really demonstrate that there is a God. And it was around that time that I sort of realised to myself that I'd been presupposing. I'd just been, okay, the scriptures are an accurate representation. There is a God, and the scriptures are an accurate representation of God's work and movement within the world and in relation to people. And it was sort of around this time that I kind of realised and that I couldn't. Things started to unravel, and I thought, I can't I can't get my head around the idea that there is a God any longer. I had just been assuming it to be the case, and I didn't really have a good reason for doing that. And around this time, there was a good friend that I was confiding in, a good friend that I was talking with, spending a lot of time with, a single mother who was on the parish council. She had a daughter in the school, and we were great friends. And I'd go to her place and we'd have a coffee and all that. Everything was all above board, and we'd speak a lot. And I was talking with her. And so this things were sort of happening in quick succession. I found myself struggling with the idea of being able to determine whether there was a God or not. Kind of thought, well, I'm just going to put this in a box for now, as a lot of us are very good at compartmentalising various things of our lives. I thought, well, I'll keep going just from the social, working with people, trying to give a bit of support and help to people. And around that time, I was moved out of the parish so about a year after the fires, I was moved out of the parish. And that was tough, but I was close enough that I was still catching up with my friend who was working in the area where she was driving into town where I was. And so we were still talking, we were still catching up. And also around that time, I think the bishop understood that I was starting to get a bit itchy feet, and I'd mentioned military chaplaincy as something that I'd like to do. So he gave me the opportunity if I wanted to go off and become a military chaplain. And I drove over to Canberra and I spoke with the bishop, because with chaplains, padres in the military, they have a bishop who's in charge of all the Catholics. So you've got the Catholics, you've got the Anglicans, and you've got the OPs, the other Protestants. That's the way that it always was. I think they've sort of relaxed things a bit now. There are a lot more evangelical padres within the padres within the military, and that's a good thing from the perspective of there's more variety, even if it all is a load of whatever. But so I told her that I was looking at the possibility of enlisting as a military chaplain, and the way she looked at me, I thought, because I thought to myself, I think I've got feelings for you, but I didn't want to say anything and stuff up a good friendship, because we were, it was a great friendship. And it was really good and nourishing and terrific for the both of us. And then I sort of realised when I saw her reaction, I realised that she might feel the same way. So we sort of got talking, and things very quickly unravelled after that from the perspective. It was only a couple of months after that I decided that, it was a couple of months before from when we realised, which was just before Christmas, and I was out at the start of March. So I'd made my mind up. I'd initially made my mind up that I'd spend the year just getting everything in order. But then another friend said, don't do that, because you're not being a good priest, and you're not being a good, you're not being good to the lady you're with. And so we decided that we wanted to be together. I went and told the bishop, and I was out of there. So that all happened fairly quickly.
How did that conversation go with the bishop?
It was very interesting, actually, because the bishop actually asked me. It worked out pretty well. it was divine providence. No, it wasn't. It was just coincidence that worked out really well. The bishop was going to a big national festival, big religious festival, and that was about 4 hours away by car. And he said to me, he said, "Are you doing anything next, whatever it was?" And I said, "No, not really." He said, "Do you reckon you could, just come with me? It'd be good. We could share the driving. It'd be just handy," because he, did a lot of driving, but sometimes he enjoyed being able to just talk and not drive. So I thought, yeah, rightio. And I told she was my fiancée then, because I made it fairly clear that we wanted to be together. And we were driving along, and we were probably 10 minutes out of town. And I said to him, "Bishop, got something to tell you." And anyway, I was driving, and I could see him in the passenger seat looking over at me. I said, after a lot of thought, I've decided that I can't continue in the priestly ministry. I'm going to leave. And anyway, things were quiet for about 20 seconds. And he sort of thought to himself, and he said, because he was a he spoke in a very dignified way, in a slow, modulated, measured way. And he said, "Matthew, I have to admit, I'm not entirely surprised." And that was quite a weight off the mind. That was like, oh, okay. That was his way of saying you weren't going to last because you were too much of your own man. You enjoyed life.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing when he says that? Do you sort of think, oh, hang on, let's be a bit more upset?
It's honest, and I took it as a good thing, because it was like, okay, you acknowledge the fact that if it's not for me, it's not for me. So I mean, he was good in that sense, and I appreciated that. He did, there were a few things that happened afterwards. He didn't want me going straight back to, because I was going to move straight back to the town where I'd spent some years. And he was a bit concerned that, if I suddenly turned back up on the scene, that would be a big shock to a lot of people, and it would be a scandal, as they called it. And so he wanted me to go away. He wanted me to, just get out of town let the dust settle a bit before I came back. So what I did was I went down to my brother's place down in Melbourne, and went down on the Saturday, and then went down on the Tuesday, and then on the Saturday I decided to forget this. So I drove back up, hid the car at my brother-in-law's place behind his big high fence, and just laid low. And didn't lay low for all that long, because I started being seen around town. So I just thought, oh well, stuff you, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And I was very fortunate, actually, because I got a phone call from a bloke that I'd had a bit to do with, who ran a local business. And he rang me and he said, because his kids were at one of the schools, and he said, Matt, I've got the newsletter that says that you've taken, because what I officially said was, I'm taking 3 months to consider my future, 3 months leave to consider my future. That's sort of how they do it. And, in case I changed my mind and wanted back in the sideshow. But he said, I've read the newsletter. He says, "Are you okay?" And I just said, "Yeah, I've decided to leave," because he knew what was going on. We'd been seen around town. Funny enough, everything was completely above board. As I say to people, nothing happened while I was a priest. It all happened about 3 hours after. But anyway, so
that would have been the longest 3 hours of your life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And but it was people were terrific. And this fella said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm really not sure." And he says, "Well, I need someone who can do admin. They've got a position going, if you like." And that was fantastic. And I ended up working there in a local workshop for 6 years, and then moved on to other things, working in this, I suppose you'd say, the human resources sort of side of things, which is where I am now, working with people, sort of kind of social work. And but that was really handy, because I was then able to provide for myself. We ended up, my wife and I, we got married in the following year. So yeah, 11 months after I officially proposed, a few weeks after I got out, and we got married on Valentine's Day the following year. Just happened to be a Saturday, so that was kind of convenient around the time that we wanted to. And it's great, because
was it in the Catholic Church?
It was not. Funny enough, it was. Because the status of a Catholic priest who leaves is basically the funny thing happened before a few days before I was due to get married. I got a letter. A fairly embarrassed young priest who was one of the canon lawyers. So you've got church law, which is they call canon law, which is all the church rules about everything. And he gave me a letter from the bishop which said, I understand that you're going to get married this weekend. It's not considered valid in the eyes of the church. If you do so, you'll lose your position and your faculties and your authority to represent the church, which was fine because I was out of it well and truly by then. And it's kind of like saying, you lose your driver's license when you haven't driven for a year. So, or lose your pilot's license when you can't fly anymore. Big deal. But
it's pretty poor form. Even though you were out of it, it's pretty poor form to do that.
Medieval, yeah. Exactly right.
It sort of seems it's a little bit undignified.
It kind of was, but I was just like, yeah, rightio, whatever. I mean, there was a legal process that they probably thought that they had to go through. And if I wanted to get married in the church, or if I want to be in good standing in the church, what I have to do is there's a process, they call it the dispensation process, which is basically you write a letter to the Pope saying this is why I would like to be received back into good standing, even if not as a member of the clergy. But I mean, obviously, it was well beyond that. But there are, back in the day, people who left because they fell in love but still had faith would go through that process. But I never decided never to do so. And I mean, so technically, I'm in a bit of trouble if I die. But I'm not too worried about that. So I suppose
I've got some good news for you.
Mm-hmm. I'm guessing it's the good news that the same happy situation that I hold these days about what happens when you die.
Well, I liked what I don't know if you ever saw when Kerry Packer he died and came back and I remember they interviewed him and they said so Mr. Packer was what did you see when you died? And he said I've got some good news and some bad news. He said the bad news is I didn't go to heaven. He said the good news is there was no hell either.
Exactly right. Exactly. So and that was the funny thing. But when at the time that I left, and particularly after for some years, I put it all in a box. Didn't go to church. Didn't even think things of faith. Didn't even worry about it. And it was only in sort of more recent times that I started examining it again after I sort of stumbled across a number of podcasts. And that's when I really looked at it all again, and I decided, what I thought after the fires hasn't changed. I can't justify that theistic position, and here I am.
So, as far as after you'd left, was there any attempt to drag you back into the church, or to did you have the local parishioners praying for you, or wanting you to come back, or even as a member of the church?
Well, funny enough, most of the local parishioners were fantastic. As in, they should let you get married. It's stupid, the rule that a priest can't get married. Most people were absolutely fantastic. There was a very small group, probably only 3 or 4, who were, I suppose, rude about it or quite, dismissive, and you've done a bad thing and it's what you've done is wrong and all of that. But that didn't bother me because, 2 of them I worked it out with just by talking, and they came to accept that, I've made my choices, and the third one died. So, I mean, that was fine.
Yeah.
And I mean...
And I bet they were all married, weren't they?
They were. So, funny about that. So, exactly right. So, that wasn't a great... I kind of slotted straight back into the social life of the place. And, no, that was really good. So people didn't feel that they needed to get me back involved, but I ended up getting involved in various other ways anyway. So sorry about the moving around. I'm just...
No, that's okay. So it sounds like you've probably had a more fortunate experience than most, because I'd imagine, especially as far as employment goes, I guess there's not a lot of transferable skills from...
No. Exactly right. And that some years later, when I hit about 40, and the place where I was working hit some pretty rough times, that's when I really started to stress out, because I thought, I'm in my early 40s. I've got, theological qualifications. Yeah, that's useful. I didn't have any proper quals that were transferable or anything like that. And it was only because I happened to be in a small town where there were some employment opportunities, and I was able to sort of move into the social work side of things, that, after when the workshop that I was involved in, things really got tough there, a position came up doing social work, and I was able to get a start there, and was interviewed and all, and got a start there, which was very helpful. But yeah, a lot of ex-priests over the years moved very much into social work, drug and alcohol counselling, mental health work. A lot became psychologists, the ones who were able to study. Funny enough, things like legal things. I know a couple of lawyers who were priests. I know a couple of accountants who were priests.
Okay.
But that was ones who were able to study afterwards. So a lot of them had really tough, really, a lot of tough times getting by while they were studying. Probation and parole officers, back in the 80s, quite a few priests who moved into that side of things, working with that. And, I know a couple of older fellas who now retired, who went down that path, and, working with prisoners, inmates, people in the parole and probation side of things, was again. So if you're half, get out there as a priest, you can become very good at working with people. So those sort of positions that involve a lot of working with people in difficult times. Oh, hello, here's my big orange cat who's just decided. Here we go. Harry.
Oh, hello.
Heather. No, I'm going to have to move you. Sorry there, buddy.
All good.
Yeah, so working with people, so it's in that human side of things, but it's getting the start. It's being able to study. It's being able to, look after yourself while you're getting qualifications there. That is tough for a lot of them. So yeah, I was pretty fortunate in that I was able to step into a job. And
is there a large community for ex-priests out there? Like, is there? I guess, do you have support structures in place, or is
not really? Especially because the current generation of young priests. So the sort of the view to explain it to people who aren't from the new, more recent Catholic background is, even within Catholicism, there are very progressive, sort of liberal sides of it, and there's fairly conservative side of it. So after they had the big Second Vatican Council, big church-wide, big worldwide gathering of bishops in Rome in the 60s, and they changed a lot of things then, the way that they did things, like the services were to be held in English rather than Latin, and they sort of started sort of liberalising things. And so a lot of the priests who came out in the 60s and 70s were quite liberal and progressive. But then there was a bit of a backlash, because there were people who thought that they'd gone too liberal and progressive. So a bit of a new conservative movement that came along with Pope John Paul in the 80s and 90s kind of took sway. And where I studied was very conservative, so I fitted in pretty well, and I, looked great in a great suit with a collar, the little plastic inset. I used to tell people it killed ticks and fleas. Exactly right. I used to tell people that they killed ticks and fleas for up to 6 months, but the little collar. But so yeah, there was very much a liberal and conservative divide, and so where I was, of course, I was pretty much ostracised by most of the still active conservative priests, and the liberal priests sort of looked on me with suspicion because I'd come from that conservative background. So there's one priest that I have a fair bit to do with. Exactly right. So the problem was solved by having nothing to do with any of them and just getting on with life. So when I look at it as an outsider now, and I still sort of see it every now and then a little bit, what the things that happen, and I see names that I haven't seen for years, and gives me a bit of a chuckle, really. So yeah, the structures and the support that I have found since I've left have been sort of non-church related, really.
And have you had any, I guess, religious hangovers? I know we kind of joked about it before, but I know that one thing that a lot of people have when they get out of religion is they still do have that guilt or that fear of hell. And I know guilt's a big thing within the Catholic Church.
No one does guilt like Catholic. I say to people sometimes, I've got a Jewish mother and a Catholic father. It's great. I've got shame and guilt. But yeah, there was a bit of guilt, especially, was I doing the right thing? But I think because I'd kind of put the whole faith side of thing in a box, I thought I'm going to worry about that later. And so by the time that I came to look at it, I sort of intellectualized it, thinking that, okay, if there is a God, if I'm doing the wrong thing, well, God can read my heart and know that I did it out of good motives, and I'll just hope for the best. But again, so that definitely was there for a while, but I was able to get on with life and get over that. But it did hang around for a little while.
Yeah, and that is I guess it's a hard thing, and I think a lot of people that I've spoken to, I know from my own experiences walking away from religion, it is hard, because I guess you're questioning in your head, well, have I walked away if I've still got these fears? Have I, and I guess there's that uncertainty with where you're at. So I guess we'll get to the end of it, but I guess one thing that I would ask is, what advice would you have, particularly, I guess, for Catholics who are questioning their faith and wanting to walk away, and those in the priesthood? What advice would you give them, or what can you offer?
Go with your instincts. If you think one thing that I hadn't really got into tonight, we touched on it briefly about careerism and all of that. And so some of the priests who were in sort of like running things in the bureaucracy, as well as the bureaucrats, the full-time bureaucrats, were very careerist and very, not spiritual at all. It was very much just a job, and very threw their weight around and threw their power around and made decisions almost on a whim. And you could find yourself moved around from parish to parish. This priest that I still have a bit to do with, he saw that he was moved around by the bishop just on a whim, and so you can find yourself without any sort of recourse to, this is going to happen, and these are the decisions that are going to massively impact your life, but too bad, just deal with it. So I suppose my advice would be, if you see things that are unjust and you feel that they're unjust, acknowledge that, and you don't have to. Your well-being for yourself, be kind to yourself, ask the difficult questions of yourself and of others. If you think there are things in, biblical things that are a problem, or if you think that there are things that, within the teachings, of the church that are a problem, have a look at them, see why they're a problem. And, for me, they were enough of a problem that, I didn't want to be part of it anymore. And, the water, come on in, the water's fine. It's great out, and it's not stifling, and it's not, you find yourself freed from so much that you thought had to be true and you had to do. So it's like, well, give it a go and be good to yourself.
Now, I've only had the one question come through. I just got a message on Twitter.
Yeah.
So they're wanting to know, when you left, were you just thrown out on the street, or does the church actually provide accommodation, or do they have a pathway, for lack of a better term?
Well, when the bishop said to me that he wanted me to move out of town for a while just to let the dust settle, he was willing to. My brother said he was willing to pay some of my expenses for 3 months. But what often happens is, basically, you've got to get your property out of there fairly quick, smart. And I was able to. The funny thing was where I moved into was 6 doors down from the church. So I was able to move things fairly quickly. That was helpful. But so you're not exactly kicked out on the street, but it's made fairly clear to you that you'll get a little bit of support so you don't starve. But we would prefer that you made other plans as quickly as possible.
Okay. Nice and very Christian of them. But good they don't throw you out the street.
Yes.
Look, just want to really thank you for your time.
Absolute pleasure.
Like I said, it would be a huge thing to, I guess, firstly make the decision to go into the priesthood. To walk away, I'd imagine, would have been very difficult. Although it sounds as though it's worked out pretty well for you. And,
it has.
Certainly, meeting your wife and from the sounds of things, a good life. So look, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. And to everyone who's watching, whether it's online now or watching this down the track, thank you for joining us. And
thank you, folks.
Make sure you subscribe, like, hit the notifications bell, and we'll catch you all later.
Good on you, folks. Thank you.